Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm really glad to be able to make some remarks in support of this bill, the Public and Educational Lending Rights, Better Income for Authors, consequential amendments, etc. It's a significant consolidation of the arrangements that have been in place since the Whitlam government quite rightly decided that authors should get the benefit for the proliferation of their works through libraries and educational institutions as a matter of fairness. And so I support what this government has done in extending that to cover digital formats, which, as the member for Bonner rightly said, is the way that many Australians now get to enjoy Australian stories, Australian literature. But I also support it and am glad for this opportunity just to highlight again the significance of the contribution that Australian authors and writers and storytellers and picture book illustrators provide for our broad well-being and for the sustainment of our distinctively Australian identity. Making sure that authors and writers get fairly paid for the work that they do is a matter of justice for those people as workers, as frankly as Australian manufacturers. You know, we talk about a future made in Australia. There are very few more important things that we make in this country than cultural products. So when we consider books and stories, when we consider films and music and works of theatre and dance and all of those many expressions of creativity and cultural production, that is something essential to life in Australia. It is actually, if you think about things that are made in Australia and manufacturing in Australia, it really is, or it really should be, at the very top of the priority tree. Because while we want to see more and more things made in Australia as a matter of economic diversification and economic self-sufficiency and supply chain sovereignty and all of those things, the reality is that with respect to some products, it probably doesn't matter a great deal at the end of the day in the lived experience of Australians whether, say, a beverage, for instance, was manufactured in Australia or whether beverage came in from overseas. I like to drink Australian-made beverages, but at the end of the day, if someone gives you a glass and it's got lemonade in it, the experiential difference between lemonade that may have been made here or lemonade that may have been imported is not all that different. When it comes to cultural products, it is a vast difference. It is not the same to say that if all the novels we read in this country were written somewhere else, that there will be no difference to the quality of Australian life. It is not true to say that if all the music we listened to, all the theatre we saw, all the films that we enjoyed were made somewhere else, that there would be no experiential difference, no difference to our identity, no difference to our capacity to understand ourselves, to consider our circumstances, to imagine our best future. It's not true to say that that wouldn't be massively affected for the worse if we weren't able to have access, particularly as young Australians, to the stories and songs and theatrical performances and dance that has its origins here in our experience, in our landscape. And especially, of course, those works that touch on, draw upon, engage with, seek to interrogate and resolve the most interesting and complex parts of our identity and our history, starting with our First Nations cultural heritage, our most precious heritage, the longest continuous civilisation on Earth. So those things are sustained by arts and creativity and cultural production and all the people who contribute to that in Australia, and it is essential, it is vital. And we know that the health of that broad creative ecosystem is at risk from time to time by all of the things that can impact on the people who are drawn vocationally to make that contribution, and some of them are those global market forces. You know, there are times when it would be easier and cheaper if what we watched on our screens had been made somewhere else, but we cannot accept that. We cannot allow that to occur. And one of the ways that we make sure that Australian storytelling and Australian voices and Australian experience and Australian language is kept at the core of our national experience is by making sure that the people who devote themselves and their skill and their expertise to that enterprise are properly supported. And this is just one small part of it. I'm not here to say today that public lending rights make the distinctive difference. There are a whole range of things, and we need to keep focusing on them. I know that Minister Burke and the Special Envoy for Arts, the member for Macquarie, who's just entered the Federation Chamber Deputy Speaker, are at work on that all day, every day. For me, writing and storytelling and books is special for a couple of reasons. When I was young, it was my ambition to make a life as a writer. And in some ways, when people say, well, how did you ultimately come to be involved in representative work, I say that it was by first being a failed novelist. And I worked as a travel writer, and I wrote and published short fiction and did a range of things, and I don't regret any of the many wonderful and sometimes difficult and frustrating hours that I spent on those novel manuscripts, even though ultimately they weren't good enough to sort of enter the public realm or end up on the shelves of a library. But from my own personal experience, I know that the contribution that writers and authors make is massive. I've had some experience in seeking to be a contributor to that unsuccessfully. I've obviously had much more extensive experience as a reader, and I know that there are, well, I would say virtually every Australian will have some Australian stories as part of the formation of themselves, as part of the way that they came to understand the things that are valuable to them and precious in their community through reading, particularly stories that allow us to see ourselves and to understand ourselves better. So I really welcome what this is contributing, and I want to take the opportunity while talking about the necessary support of Australian writing and Australian literature just to reflect on its significance in my community in Fremantle. Fremantle has been a place that has nurtured the creative arts in all its dimensions over a long period of time, and that includes a number of significant writers, and it includes a number of significant literary organisations, and a couple of them have celebrated birthdays recently, and I just want to touch upon that. First and foremost, Fremantle Press. Fremantle Press just marked its 50th anniversary. It has been one of the most critical arts and cultural organisations in Western Australia, and as a matter of full disclosure, my wife Georgia works at Fremantle Press as the fiction and non-fiction publisher, and I think the work she does is amazing. You know, one of the things I love in my house is to occasionally be allowed into her study, and I get to see the shelves of books that she's had a hand in seeing into print. You know, and I think that's an incredible legacy. I sometimes wonder about the impact I might be having on the world when I see you know, all of the really amazing stories, fiction and non-fiction, that Georgia has supported authors to see become part of our experience in Australia. It reminds me that the work that cultural creators do in this country is seriously undervalued, and I think what Fremantle Press has done, some of the hardest work actually in the kind of publishing world, is dedicated to identifying and seeing into print particularly unpublished Western Australian voices, and that is a challenge in a great continent like ours, because some jurisdictions that are outside the sort of Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra triangle can face all of the barriers and some of the disadvantages that come from that smaller scale and that distance. And so having a press like Fremantle Press in WA to help bring forward for all of our benefit writers like Elizabeth Jolly, A.B. Facey, Sally Morgan, Kim Scott, Joan London, Dave Warner, Dave Wish-Wilson, Diane Wolfer, and many, 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 many others. So, I say happy birthday to Fremantle Press and recognise the incredible work that they've done over 50 years, and I know will continue for the next half century and beyond. And I'm glad that the Creative Australia +1 program has been able to support Fremantle Press in finding their new headquarters in the old SEC substation down in Fremantle, what will be their forever home. And I think as they reach the half century, to be able to occupy a new headquarters after having moved various times over the years is a great step in securing that foundation for Western Australian writing for a considerable period of time. Deputy Speaker, I also want to acknowledge the 10th birthday of Paperbird Bookshop. It's Perth's only specialist children's bookshop, and it also functions as a dedicated arts and cultural centre for young people. It was created 10 years ago down in Fremantle, and it's a beautiful place, and it's a place that for lots and lots of young people and their parents and not so young people, it's become a real kind of a treasure island, I suppose, of children's and young adult literature and the work by illustrators that's often part of that work, including lots of books that Paperbird stocks and that Fremantle Press has also been involved in, that draw upon our incredibly rich First Nations history, both the subject matter of those stories, but also the language, Noongar first word books and these kinds of publications, which I wish I had had the benefit of being able to read when I read books at primary school, but which kids now do get to enjoy, and that's a thing we should recognise. I'll just conclude, Deputy Speaker, by saying that we need to maintain our focus on the importance of cultural production, that kind of future made in Australia, and we need to keep recognising that however our system works, it doesn't properly reward or support those kinds of producers. That's just the way it is. The average income of an Australian writer is just a bit more than $18,000, so it doesn't even get over the tax-free threshold. The public lending rights arrangements do send sort of significant and rightful support to the producers of those works, but if you look at that $28 million across 17,000 payments, it's probably $1,700 on average per author. It's an important contribution. They ought to have it as a matter of right, but we should nevertheless recognise that if you are a writer or a musician or a playwright or a person who's creating original choreography, a painter, a visual artist, you are struggling. You make a choice out of that vocational commitment, and what goes with that choice inevitably is economic uncertainty. And for many, many Australian artists, the reality is that while they pursue their art and while they make that essential contribution to all of our well-being, they almost start from the position of having to say, well, what's going to be the way that I earn a living so that I can also write these incredible novels, so that I can also produce these amazing albums and these great films and so on. And we need to say to ourselves, that's not right, and we should continue to try to be creative in finding ways to make sure that those creators and those workers get a fair go, because it's good that you can be I say this sort of cautiously, you could be a run-of-the-mill anything. You could be a run-of-the-mill bricklayer, you could be a run-of-the-mill dentist, you could be a run-of-the-mill politician, and you will be able to earn a fair living. You can be an absolute first-rate author, a first-rate musician, a first-rate playwright, and you will struggle. You will struggle. There are so few Australian artists who can really go into their work as a professional and have the expectation of that security, and that's something we should keep trying to fix.